The late summer of 1971 was a very important time in the history of photography, in my opinion, because the Nikon F2 was introduced. Welcome to another edition of Jules Voto's Photo Focus. Now, as many of you know who have watched my videos, I first got interested in photography in 1970. In 1971, I bought a Pentax H1A. In 72, I traded that camera in for a Pentax Spotmatic. And finally, in the fall of 1972, I picked up a Nikon FTN, my first Nikon camera. Previous to that, I read everything I could on photography. And in the fall of 1970, I got my first issue of Modern Photography. In November of that year, I bought my first issue of Popular Photography, and that's how I found out a lot about the cameras that were available and everything about photography. Of course, there was no internet back then, so you had to rely on magazines, going into your local camera shop and speaking with the representatives there. Occasionally there may be a Nikon rep or a Canon rep or whatever who was in, and you could question them, but that was about it. So there wasn't nearly as much information available as there is today. Well, as I started reading those magazines, I kind of fell in love with Nikons. I guess it's because most of the pros back then who shot 35mm single lens reflex cameras used Nikons. I was very impressed with their ads, the beautiful images, the pictures of the cameras. You know, I was a kid of, 16, 17 years old, and I was very impressed with those ads. I was very impressionable. So, in the fall of 1971, in fact, it was in the November 1971 issue of Modern Photography, one of my favorite columnists at the time, Herbert Kepler, in his column, Kepler on the SLR, introduced, to me at least, the Nikon F2. It was a long article explaining all the features of the camera. Well, I shouldn't say all. There were so many features on that camera. There were so many accessories. But he went into a good bit of detail, and I fell in love with that camera. However, it was way out of my price range at the time. In fact, the F2 with 50mm 1.4 Nikkor was listed at $550, but I really wanted an F2. It was impossible. No way I was going to get it. So a year later, I got the Nikon, and then probably a year after that, I picked up a used Nikon F with standard prism finder, I believe. But I was always impressed with the F2, and it took a while before the first report on the camera came out, the first test report. And that first test report, or as they called it, lab report, was in Popular Photography in February of '73. Modern Photography didn't do a test, they called it Modern Tests, until January of '74. And their reason for that was because this was a system camera. They didn't want to do a report just on the camera. They wanted to do a report on with a lot of the accessories, the motor drives, the various finders, and so forth that were available for this camera. So that's when Modern did their report. Now, the serial numbers on Nikon F2 cameras pretty much line up with the year of production. So the early cameras started with 71. The latest cameras, 79 and 80. And that camera was discontinued in early 1980 when the Nikon F3 came out. Now, as I said, I subscribed to those two magazines, Popular and Modern Photography, and actually anything I could get my hands on. Then there was Peterson's Photographic. I think the first issue of that I picked up was in 1974. I was working for a photo lab that also had a camera store, so there were some industry publications that the owner gave me. So I really did a lot of reading on photography. Of course, went to the library and read a bunch of books too. But what happened, since I subscribed to so many publications, in fact, a little later on, it was Shutterbug and Outdoor Photographer and all kinds of photography magazines. Over time, I accumulated a huge collection. And about 20 some odd years ago, 22, 23 years ago, I knew we were going to be moving. So what I did, I started to go through those magazines and tear out the articles that were important to me, subjects that were important to me, and a lot of those were articles on Nikon cameras, even Nikon ads, test reports. So what I did, I took file folders and filled them up with information. For this one, this says here Nikon test report. So there's a bunch of Nikon test reports. And I saved everything Nikon. And also I saved everything Leica that I could find, although I never did purchase a Leica camera, although I really loved the Leica M4 back in the day. I've actually never handled one. Eventually, when I did get to try out a Leica rangefinder, I think it was an M3, the viewfinder just didn't work for me with glasses. So anyway, so I accumulated all this stuff. And so I still have it all in file cabinets and boxes in these file folders. So what I did recently, I figured I'm going to do something on the F2. I have said before in previous videos that I believe that the Nikon F2 is the finest mechanical 35mm camera ever made. And I stick with that. I stand by that. Now, early on, however, and I only knew this through reading about it, apparently there were some problems in the early models of the F2 in 1971, and I believe continuing into 1972. In fact, Moose Peterson, who has a handbook on Nikon cameras, stated that some early models with serial numbers starting with 71 and 72, they had some wind problems. There were problems with the film transport system. Also, Bob Shell in Shutterbug in May of 1987 said there were problems with early F2s, and it was ironed out in about a year. And also in Modern's Tests from January of 1974, it stated that there were early teething problems. So again, I have no first-hand experience with this. I didn't buy my first Nikon F2 until 2018. So all those years, I never owned an F2. I owned an F3, an F4, an F100, and of course a bunch of Nikon digital, but never had an F2. Finally bought an F2 Photonic, the one you see right here, in 2018. About a year later, I picked up a Nikon F2AS, which was the ultimate Nikon F2 and my favorite by far. And anytime today that I shoot film, I go to that Nikon F2AS. It still works perfectly. So early on, of course, Nikon was running ads, and I have all this stuff. I know you might think I'm crazy, but here was one of the first ads I saw on the F2. This is dated May of 1972. I believe this was Popular Photography. And this had a lens from 1971, a 50mm 1.4 mounted on the camera in the photo in the ad from 1971. A month later, this ad appeared. And it's a several page ad, but I'm just showing you the first page. This was from June of 1972. And the lens on this camera dates from 1966. Now, maybe only I would notice that or be interested in that, but I thought it was kind of strange that on the previous ad, they used a newer lens. And on an ad just a month later, they used this much older lens. I don't know, maybe you don't care about that. But the lab reports, the modern test report, the lab report from Popular, which I have here, this dates from, what did I say? This dates from, sorry. I just have too much stuff. Pop Photo's lab report dates from February of 1973, and Modern's is from January of 1974, correct. And this was a more comprehensive report in modern photography because they had a lot of the accessories by then. So they gave you a lot of information on the accessories, where primarily in the Pop Photo lab report, it was just the camera and the 50mm 1.4 lens. The thing I like better about Popular Photography's test lab reports was they gave these charts here with showing the shutter accuracy, the viewfinder accuracy, the focusing system, even went through a stripped down report, the material choice in the interior and exterior, assembly finish, and so forth and so on. So, needless to say, I was very impressed with this camera, but unfortunately, I was never able to buy one. And when I did have the money to afford one, the F3 came out, and I decided to go with the more modern camera. So I still love the F2. I loved it before I touched it. I loved it before I owned it. And I love it to this day, even with all the modern cameras that I own. So I've done some reports on the F2. I've done a comparison of the F2 and the Nikon FFTN. I went over the meters for the F2, but I think I'm going to do an updated video on the Nikon F2. I think the quality of my videos is better now, and I think I did that video like almost 3 years ago. So I'm going to update that. I'm also going to update a comparison of the F2 to the Nikon FTN so-called Apollo, which was the last of the Nikon F bodies. So let me hear your Nikon F2 story. I know when I say in some of my videos that I believe it's the finest mechanical single lens reflex camera ever made, 35mm single lens reflex camera. A lot of people agree with me, and I'd like to hear your F2 stories. Leave them in the comments below. I always try to respond to all comments and all questions, and let me know what you would like me to cover in future videos. I value your opinion and your comments, of course, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say. So if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. I publish a new video every Monday morning and Wednesday morning at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. So thanks for watching, and I will talk to you soon.